Hi, everybody. This is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. And I am super excited to say that I'm here with Randal Rauser, Dr. Randal Rauser, and he is a professor up at Taylor Seminary in Canada. And he's going to share a little bit of his knowledge today on some apologetic stuff. And we're going to talk about what happens after we die. So I know that's a big question. And he's got some really well-developed answers. And so I was just telling him, I haven't taken I haven't put my stake in the ground. I've just tried to been looking at both sides. So I think this conversation hopefully will educate me, and I'm sure it'll educate all of you. If you're not familiar with the area, or even if you really are familiar with the area, but you haven't taken a side yet, or you're not sure which way to go. Today, it's great that you're here, Dr. Rauser, and we're gonna, without further ado, let me go ahead and ask Dr. Rauser to introduce himself.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, SJ. It's good to be joining you all on this very important topic. So I do teach at Taylor Seminary in Edmonton, Canada. So if you think it's about a 4.5-hour drive from the Montana border north, that's where I live. And I've been teaching here for about 17 years. I have a PhD from London, England. I've written about, I think, 11 books. Actually, I just finished my 12th one. It should be coming out in a little while. And I wrote a book on heaven, and I've published some chapters in other contexts on hell as well. And I mean, I teach systematic theology to seminary students every year. And so these issues are certainly very live issues for me. And I enjoy sort of the melding of theological reflection, careful theological reflection, and apologetic defense of the faith. So I think I'm in a good place this afternoon as we have our conversation.
Yeah, so it is really interesting stuff. I mean, it's probably one of the most fascinating topics out there, because everyone wants to know what's going to happen when I die. You want to know, am I going to be in heaven and paradise, and what even is paradise like? So what does the Bible tell us that heaven is like?
Right. Well, good place to start. So there are a couple different approaches. One approach is, you could sort of call it a theocentric approach, and it's often been described in terms of beatific vision. And it's the idea where in heaven, you just have this experience of God, and you kind of enter into this almost like a timeless state of just ecstasy as you partake of God. Now, I'm a little bit more inclined to an alternative view, which is a little more centered on the role of creation as part of the redemption story. So the basic idea is this: that Jesus, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, is the first fruits of our future resurrection, right? So Jesus and his resurrection body is what we look forward to in our future. Sometimes Christians have a very sort of Platonic view of the afterlife, which means that they think about it as just souls going on existing forever apart from bodies. But in fact, the Hebrew hope and the Christian hope is always about a resurrection of the body. And so just as Jesus's body was raised again, and so his new resurrection body actually was his old body renewed and glorified, so for us, our future resurrection body is actually our bodies that we have now, renewed and glorified. So then I just carry that logic through, and you observe that, for example, in Romans chapter 8, Paul talks about creation groaning, longing for the sons of God to be revealed. And so that creation has been torn out or sort of brought into our bondage to decay will likewise be liberated, as will we. So what Paul seems to be saying there in Romans 8 is that creation's redemption is also tied into our redemption. And so when we look in the New Testament and in Isaiah and in 2 Peter, we have references in Revelation to a new heavens and new earth. I think that the way we should understand that is just the way we understand our bodies, that our new bodies are actually our old bodies renewed, brought to fullness of being. And so heaven, so to speak, will actually be the new heavens and new earth, the original creation, brought to the fullness of God's being. So what that means then is that I look forward in terms of heaven to the restoration of God's creation brought to the fullness for which he had purposed it since the beginning of time.
Yeah, and I've seen stuff like it be a New Jerusalem, and this idea, are there pearly gates up there?
Yeah, so that's those are all images, of course, from the book of Revelation. And I think we always have to keep in mind that the book of Revelation is very much symbolic in its imagery. So for example, the dimensions of the New Jerusalem, it has often been pointed out, seem to echo the dimensions of the temple in Jerusalem. And so as the New Jerusalem descends to earth at the end of Revelation 21, the message there seems to be that the fullness of God's presence is now in the creation as it was intended to be from the beginning. Because if you remember when Jesus prays the Lord's Prayer, he says, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." That's an eschatological prayer. In other words, a prayer that we pray that the new Jerusalem would descend and his fullness of his presence would be in creation. And so that's what I look forward to. So I don't interpret that literally. I interpret that as a symbolic message conveying the fullness of God's presence in his kingdom.
That's very interesting stuff. Now, I get asked a lot when people try to sort of stump you, they'll say, well, can you sin in heaven? Is that possible?
Yes, I don't think that is possible. So the first thing we have to keep in mind is that the center of a Christian's life right now, what we have to worry about is sanctification. And what sanctification means is it's growing in holiness or being set apart. And the end goal of sanctification is to be fully conformed to the image of God's Son, who is Jesus. So Jesus is described in the New Testament as the image of God. And in Romans 8:29, for example, he describes that we are to be conformed to that image, that we are working toward full conformity to the image. So when sanctification is complete, we become like Jesus. And I think it's pretty important to recognize that Jesus, as fully God, he cannot sin. Now, there is a conversation to be had about how you understand the temptations of Jesus, but that could be a rabbit trail depending on where you want to go. But I would just simply say that when you are fully conformed to the image of God, you will look upon sin as disgusting and repugnant. It doesn't mean you lose free will, because free will simply means that you strip away all the self-destructive impulses. There are still an innumerable number of things we could eat. So I say eat because I often use a buffet analogy. So I'll just give you this and then be quiet for a bit. So I have dogs, and I've witnessed other dogs in the dog park engage in a pretty horrendous behavior, coprophagia, which is where they'll eat feces. And of course, this is age-old question that dog owners have always asked, which is, why would dogs eat feces? And I've read up and researched that, and actually I think the best answer is because they like it. But we look at feces and we think that's utterly disgusting and repugnant. And I think that we have to recognize that from God's perspective, sin is like feces. It's disgusting and repugnant. So when we are fully conformed to his image in Christ, we will likewise look upon sin as disgusting and repugnant. We would never touch it. But there's still a buffet of innumerable things we can eat, or innumerable good actions we can do, even if self-destructive evil actions are not open to us.
Wow. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The dog, because that definitely gives us a visual, and it's not a very pleasant visual. So I can understand that. And yeah, that's the thing that people say about God, that God is, of course, he's without sin. And even at the point when Jesus was hanging on the cross at the very end, he had referred to his father as his father the other two times when he was praying to him. But here he referred to him as my God, why have you forsaken me? Because he had taken on the sins of the world. And so it was like God could not be with him. So that's just an interesting thing. Now, the other flip side that I know our friends in the audience, especially the ones that I know are heathens or atheists who are in there, I know that they're going to want to know what your take on hell is. So what would you say is hell? I mean, what happens? Is there a Hades and hell? Are they different?
Well, that's a good place to begin. So they are different concepts. Sometimes they get conflated together, but the idea of, so I guess to understand them, we first have to understand that there's something in the Bible called progressive revelation. So over time, there is evolving or a development, a growth or emergence of theological understanding. If you go back to the Old Testament and the earliest texts in the Old Testament, there isn't a clear understanding of the afterlife. What there seems to be, which was very common in the ancient world, is a belief that when people die, they go to some place that was actually commonly understood to be physically underneath the earth, and it was called Sheol in Hebrew. And so what you would do is your body would go on the ground, but your spirit would go to Sheol, and you would just kind of have this existence in Sheol, which was kind of just a shadowy echo of life up here on earth. And so you kind of get this understanding reflected in 1 Samuel 28. Saul, through the witch of Endor, he calls Samuel back from the dead. And so Samuel comes up and says, "Why have you disturbed me?" And it's very much like the image of a ghost. I mean, that's what you understand a ghost to be, is a dead, deceased person who interacts with the living. And so that's actually a ghost, which is an interesting conversation in itself. But that's the idea of Sheol. So then eventually, in the intertestamental period, depending on when you would place the writing of the book of Daniel, but it's usually placed in the intertestamental period, maybe around the time of the Maccabean Revolution. That would be in the 170s or something. A clear reference to a general resurrection in Daniel 12:2. So he talks about a future resurrection where our bodies will actually come back to life. And what after some period of time in Sheol, the soul or the spiritual part of a person will be reunited with their body, and they will enjoy some existence once again. So that's how we begin to come toward that idea. And so by the time that we're into the first century, then Jesus, there's this clear understanding, certainly among the Pharisees, of this general resurrection. The Sadducees, you've probably heard the old Sunday school joke that the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection, so they were so sad, you see. But the Pharisees did, and those are the people that Jesus was in agreement with. And so that served as the foundation for Christian understanding of the afterlife. So that's the distinction between Sheol or Hades, because Hades is just the Greek translation of Sheol, or the Greek equivalent. So that it's a place that we would call it the intermediate period now, or the interim period, that when you die, you go to this place of Sheol, and then you await the general resurrection. So then hell is clearly a distinct place, because hell, Sheol or Hades, is temporary, but hell, if it exists, is understood traditionally to be a permanent place or destiny.
Yeah, let me just say thank you, John Lloyd. He says, but buffet analogy is great. Some people treat God as a buffet. They take what they like and disregard what they don't like, except foods they won't touch. So so thank you, John. I wanted to go back to the and I read the Old Testament, and I was surprised when this is a while back, when I saw Samuel popping out, because that's, I think, the only time that I can recall that someone came back from the dead and so that was a really interesting passage.
It is a curious passage. There are other examples that are suggestive that Jews did believe such things as ghosts were possible. So you have, for example, when Jesus' disciples are in the boat, and then they see him walking in the water, and they are terrified because they think they've seen a ghost.
Oh yeah.
And so that's translated from, I think it's phantasma in the Greek. So there's a reference that was part of the background understanding of people commonly at that time, which is not that different from today. Many people think there are such things as ghosts. Now, it is, I know that you mentioned you've come from a Catholic background. So within the Catholic tradition, there was actually a very strong theology of ghosts, and that traces back to Pope Gregory I. I think that's probably fair to say. He wrote a book called Dialogues, and he talks about the experience of ghosts at the monastery. And the interesting thing there, and this is one of the reasons that Protestants have often been skeptical of ghosts, is because a theology of ghosts developed that a person would be motivated to try to contact the living because they would seek release from purgatory. And so because Protestants rejected purgatory, they often rejected the possibility of ghosts as well. But within traditional Catholic theology, there's still often a recognition of the possibility of a ghost. Mm-hmm. And often that would be motivated by them seeking help from the livings, for example, to get an indulgence and time off purgatory.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah. No, I see. I actually believe in ghosts, and I also believe in demons. And I think it's in the. I mean, is it biblical to believe that demons still exist?
Well, I mean, it's sort of interesting as to ask what does it mean to be biblical, because people often talk about being biblical, and I think they have different definitions of it. I think it's fair to say that demons are clearly part of the worldview of people who wrote scripture, and I see no reason to reject that. So now I would say that there are aspects of the worldview of people who wrote scripture that we would not want to adopt. So for example, a common understanding of a three-storied view of the universe, right? That there is a physical heaven above the earth, that Sheol was physically located below the earth. I think we know that that's not true, because we've actually apparently dug pretty deep down and haven't found Sheol. So we don't adopt that aspect anymore, but I find no reason to reject the existence of demons. I think that they exist. I've actually had my own phenomenological experiences that I would count as demonic when I was in the mission field in 1994. So I both have those experiences. I have a friend of mine Robin Perry, who actually edited a book called Exorcism and Deliverance. And that was published, I think, with Paternoster. But they actually look at serious case studies of vertical evidence for demonic beings. So there is a literature on those kinds of topics. And I think it's something, and of course, the Catholic Church, for example, when they do an exorcism, they carefully exhaust every alternative and natural explanation before they would turn to explain it in terms of spiritual agencies. So I would just ask if people are skeptical of ghosts, of demons, just keep an open mind, and because there may be more in the world than we've recognized.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I also, just because the verses with Jesus, with the demon, there's so many verses in the New Testament where they're encountering demons, or at least they think they're encountering demons, with the demons going into the pigs and that sort of thing. So I do think it's in there. It's and I've had my own experiences too. So I can say that I believe that they're out there, which is kind of scary. But I want to talk more about, so you are an annihilationist, I understand. And some people would like that idea, especially if you're an atheist. I've heard atheists often say that they don't want there to be life after this life. And so you're pretty much saying there won't be, right?
Good question. No, not exactly. So
okay.
It's good to clarify precisely what annihilationism is. So, because there are some people, they take a view that, well, if you're not within Christ, then when you die, you simply cease to exist. It's lights out. That's the end of it. Now, one of the problems with that is that it does seem to be this pretty strong teaching within the New Testament that there will be a general resurrection, which is not limited to the righteous, but also includes the unrighteous. So again, Daniel 12:2 makes reference to it. In John 5, verse 25 and 28 and 29, Jesus refers to this general resurrection idea as well and affirms it. And so that's an idea that both the righteous and the unrighteous are resurrected. The difference is that the unrighteous are resurrected to judgment. So then what the idea is that when people die, again, this is a dualist picture. So their souls depart from their bodies. That's what dualism means, that you've got these two parts, soul, body. And the soul goes to be in Sheol, or excuse me, in some place, wherever kind of state of being that is, but it's like a waiting room for eternity. And then at some point there will be a general resurrection and everybody gets their bodies back. The difference is on these two traditional views, on eternal conscious torment, on that view, then following the general resurrection, for the unrighteous or those who are outside of Christ, it is a resurrection to judgment, which results in them continuing to exist forever in some degree of suffering or torment. But for the annihilationist view, it is a general resurrection that culminates in the cessation of their being. So they're destroyed, or they cease to exist. So it's a little more complicated than simply ceasing to exist when you die. And I would encourage people not to be flippant about it and to think, oh, no big deal, because I think having a general resurrection to judgment sounds like a pretty fearful thing to experience as well.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, building on that whole idea, I was thinking about in the Bible, it sort of mentions sometimes that people were asleep. And when you think about people in the afterlife, in the Sheol or Hades, being sleeping, or if they're conscious at that time, that's my big question. Is we do have some evidence that if we look at the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, that there could be some level of consciousness in this existence as you wait for the final judgment. But I'm wondering, I was thinking to myself, I wonder if the believers might be unconscious sleeping and wake up suddenly in the final judgment, and then the non-believers would be the ones who are conscious, and maybe they would have some sort of opportunity to repent in this conscious state. So I'm wondering what your take on that is.
So yeah, this is another good question. The mainstream view on this question, like annihilationism is not the mainstream view in terms of final judgment, but in terms of this intermediate state, the mainstream view in the Christian tradition has been that people do have some degree of conscious awareness in this period. There is a minority view, which has often been called the soul sleep view. And soul sleep is typically understood to be the view that people continue to exist, but they exist in a dream-like state, that they don't have a conscious awareness of anything. So it could be that, again, dream-like in terms of they actually have some sort of dreaming process, or maybe it's just lights out. They have no awareness of anything until the general resurrection. But you're right to point out that the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, that is a parable that is not talking about hell. The rich man is not in hell. The rich man is in Sheol, or Hades, and we know that, first of all, because the Greek there is referring to Hades. That's the word. And also because it's described in the parable that his brothers are still living, and he wants to send someone back, like Marley coming back to warn Scrooge, right, about the terrible afterlife.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Abraham shuts them down and says, no, they wouldn't listen. So what that clearly does is it marks that narrative as occurring during this period prior to the general resurrection. So it's not hell, it's Sheol or Hades. And clearly what that then tells us is that they understood this common view that Jesus was working with, is that there is consciousness, some kind of conscious awareness of the world. You also have, there's some other places like in Revelation, I think it's chapter 6, where it describes the souls of the martyrs at the throne of God pleading that their blood be avenged. And I think we have to be careful about reading too much into the symbolism of Revelation, but nonetheless, I would point out that the image, whether it's metaphorical or literal, it nonetheless is set against the backdrop of the meaningfulness of the idea that people can request something of God in the intermediate period, which is certainly suggestive of the traditional view rather than the soul sleep view. So that is my view. And I just note one other thing, that there's an interesting body of literature on out-of-body experiences, which is in medical literature. So journals like The Lancet have actually published journal articles that are looking at case studies of people that were in liminal cases of medical distress, such as they were declared brain dead, and then they came to have consciousness again afterwards, and they reported having knowledge of the time when they were allegedly brain dead, including, for example, having visuals looking down on themselves being operated on. The kind of thing that it's very difficult to just explain that away. And so I'm open to that being empirical corroborative evidence for the ability to have conscious awareness apart from the body.
Yeah, that's interesting that you're bringing up the near-death experiences, because I do think that gives us some evidence of, and I believe those. I've seen a lot of accounts, and some I know there was a little retraction from some little boy named Larky, but I know that there are these other situations where sometimes people report they actually see a light, or they see heaven in some way, or they're in heaven, or even worse is sometimes they report they're in hell. I watched a YouTube video where this man somehow was in a hospital room and somebody was calling him out of the hospital room, and he was in this different state. He had left his body and he was walking down some hallway, and then he felt like this whole existence was happening forever. And then suddenly these people were tearing at his skin and tearing at his clothes and trying to hurt him. And he said it gave them some level of satisfaction. And finally, he was an atheist at the time, and finally he called out to Jesus Christ, and suddenly he's back in the back in the hospital, which, I mean, I don't know if you want to take that. Sometimes you have to take this with a grain of salt. We want to be skeptical of this kind of stuff, but what do you think about those kind of stories?
Well, so you mentioned that one book that, that's pretty ironic. The kid's name was Malarkey, and he later on admitted he made it all up. And that was the book, The Boy Who Went to Heaven, I think was the title. So that one we know wasn't true. And then there was the book Heaven is for Real.
Yeah, Colton Burpo.
That was based on Colton Burpo's case. And then there was another book that was a bestseller by Eben Alexander. That one, Proof of Heaven is the title of that one. I've read both of those books, and I think there are problems with Colton Burpo's story. I don't think it's made up. I think that he had false memories, and I think his father was not a good interviewer and was asking him leading questions that led to his forming false memories. I don't think he provides a lot of veridical evidence that he actually experienced this. Instead, he uses sort of descriptions such as people have lights on their head like halos, and they have wings, which is a lot of pop culture and the kind of thing you might learn in Sunday school, but is not what Christian theologians really think that reality will be like. So I think the simpler explanation there is that it didn't actually happen. In terms of Eben Alexander, I think that he was probably making it up. There was a good expose of him in the magazine Vanity Fair, which actually does some serious journalism, interestingly. And so they did a critique of Eben Alexander, and I think as well, like of his history of fabulation, of making things up. And also, in his case, he's got really bad theology, so the irony that people were appealing to his book was concerning to me. There is an interesting literature on near-death experiences. So Stephen Long has done case studies. I think his book is called Evidence of the Afterlife, and he's gathered thousands of case studies from around the world, not all by any means from Christians, I mean, from across different religious traditions. Now, here's a thing though, like one thing that is interesting about those cases is that they seem to be transcultural. So whether it's a Christian person in the West or some other person from another religious tradition in another part of the world, they often report having things like seeing a light at the end of a tunnel, and having their life flash before their eyes, and often having a sense of judgment and an evaluation, but also sensing the presence of love. So we have to evaluate those carefully. We also have to evaluate them theologically. The one thing I would say is that the kind of cases I was specifically targeting were not just general near-death experiences, but specifically out-of-body experiences where there is some kind of veridical evidence provided by the person making the claim that they had knowledge that they could not have had, but had they been outside their body. And so that's what's interesting to me in terms of evidence of conscious awareness apart from embodiment, is when people can give some kind of knowledge that of the kind of the surgery that was performed on them when they were allegedly, in brain dead, that kind of thing. That's what intrigues me the most.
Yeah,
I have to know
agree
what
with
to do
you.
with these other cases.
I'm not sure what to do either, because you do want to be skeptical. I don't want to be the gullible person who accepts everybody who says, I was in heaven and I saw my grandmother. You have to be a little bit skeptical. But then there's, on the other side, you do hear these stories. There was one where I saw where I think it was a woman who was in a hospital room, and she somehow saw some shoe up on the roof of the hospital. And so they went up there and they verified it. There was some shoe up on the top of I don't know how it got up there on the roof, but they verified her story, which you couldn't have done unless she, of course, somehow got up to the roof before and made up the whole thing. But those kind of things are kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's a very well-known case. That was in Seattle, and that was she alleged that there was a tennis shoe on the outer ledge of the hospital, and the nurses actually corroborated that. I'm trying to think, that might have been reported in Moody's famous book, Life After Life, which came out in the mid-70s. But that's one of the cases certainly that's been discussed. Other cases are carefully corroborated and appear in, again, journals like The Lancet, leading medical journals. Michael Sabom is a well-known Christian who wrote 2 books on these case studies, and he's a medical doctor. Pim van Lommel is a researcher, I think from the Netherlands, who's written journal articles in medical journals on these case studies. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff to be looking at.
Yeah. So what do you think and going back to our heaven talk and what you were saying, I know how Jesus says that his Father has this amazing house with many rooms. And so we have this visual of that. And I think it's one of those things where whatever heaven is, it's hard probably for us to conceive. So they put it in the terms that we could understand from our earthly perspectives. But have you ever thought about time in heaven and how that'll work? Because I know that they say time is different in heaven. It's not linear as our time is. So have you given any thought to that?
Yeah, well, yeah. So there's, the old, when the roll is called up yonder, the old hymn, and time shall be no more. It's a familiar line to some people who grew up in the church. But I think that kind of language shows, again, a certain sort of Platonizing. So what that means is it refers back to sort of the influence of Plato's theology and philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And Plato himself, he got those ideas from another philosopher named Parmenides, an ancient Greek philosopher who talked about this absolute contrast between being and becoming, and only being is real. And so the desire is to become being and to move beyond temporal succession altogether, to leave time behind, which is sort of paradoxical because it seems to be a temporal state you've left behind chronologically, right? So it kind of blows your mind if you think about it.
Yeah.
But then moving into a timeless state. And so this was the idea of that Plato, when he talks about his philosophy of the cave, this famous metaphor again, or story, allegory, I should say, to leave behind temporal being or becoming and just be. And that's where this kind of idea of the beatific vision that I mentioned earlier, I think is deeply influenced by that Platonizing vision. So I'm a skeptic of that kind of way of talking. I think that time itself is not a problem. With time just is temporal succession. It's the relationship of before and after. I don't think there's any problem per se with time. In fact, I think it's just an expression of what our experience is as created beings. I think the problem is mortality. So it's not time per se that's the issue that we have to be saved from, but rather we have to be saved from our bondage to decay, right? The fact that we are mortal beings, that we are created of the dust, and to dust we shall return. And I think that that's what gets healed in new creation, the new heavens and earth, is our mortality, rather than that we leave time behind. I think time will continue.
So what do you think people will do in heaven? Like some people have told me, some atheists have said, it's going to be so boring. I don't want to live thousands of years or an eternity. It'll run out of things to do. Do you think that we'll run out of things to do up there?
Yeah, so I talk a lot about these kinds of issues in my book, What on Earth Do We Know About Heaven? So I guess the first thing I would say is, I think a lot of the fear and of the boredom and so on, it comes from different images that I think are just not great images. So for example, the beatific vision image. Now there's something central I want to retain from that, which is that we will be partakers of the divine nature, as Peter said. We will have our relationship with God restored and in fact brought to a fullness that was never experienced even by Adam and Eve. This beautiful, incredible intimacy. But that is not to the exclusion of everything else. I think sometimes we think about God versus creation as a sort of zero-sum game, that the more focused you are on God, the less you have time for the creation around you. Like turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wondrous face, and the things of earth grow strangely dim in the light of his mercy and grace. And I think that's wrong. I think that the more we experience of God, the more it brings out the vibrant reality of creation, the goodness of creation. So in terms of what we will do, I think that we will experience creation in the most wondrous way possible, in restored relationships with one another and our Creator. So I would just say this, that think about the things that you love most now that are, of course, God-honoring and consistent with what it is to be conformed to the image of Christ. Think about those things and think about them as the palest glimpse, the palest icon pushing us forward into God's ultimate plan for us. C.S. Lewis said, the child who's not interested in heaven, or the person who's not interested in heaven is like the child who would rather play in the mud puddle than take a vacation by the sea. He cannot imagine what is being offered to him. And I think that's often the situation that we're in too.
Yeah, those are good ways to put it. And so that's really interesting. What do you think? I was thinking about the divine counsel, and I'm wondering, do you think that as humans, do you think humans will be getting an opportunity to maybe help out or give suggestions on things that are going on the earth at some point? Or are we're not going to have that? I'm trying to figure out kind of how to put that all together.
Well, one interesting thing is just to look back to the narrative of Genesis 2. And prior to the fall, the interesting thing is that Adam and Eve had work. They actually, like sometimes people think work is part of the fall, but it's not work that is part of the fall. It's rather the result of the frustration of our work, right? That, for example, the earth becomes hardened and does not yield. And so Adam has to work really hard after the fall in order to bring forth crops and so on. But the garden itself is something that is a product of culture, right? Gardens are not unclaimed wilderness. It is something that is ordered. It is cosmos, or order. And so Adam had a role. Eve had a role. They had a vocation to carry out a calling within creation. And I think that carries through even more in new creation. So C.S. Lewis, at the end of The Last Battle, he's got this repeated refrain as they enter into with what within the narrative of the Narnia story is the new creation, and that is further up and further in. And so what he's conveying to us there is the dynamic sense of moving further into God's purposes ever. Not static, not that you're not doing anything, that you're bored, but rather there's always more to do, and it's all part of your vocational calling in the new creation.
No, that's interesting. And I was saying that because I know that I realized that there's this idea that when we pass away, we go into some sort of Hades sort of thing, and we might be sleeping or we might not be sleeping, we might be conscious. But my understanding is that state is away from time. So the idea that we could actually have some thoughts on what's going on the earth is possible, following the judgment and that sort of thing. So I know that sounds funny, but if my view of time is like that, where you can go back and forth in time, then that's where I was coming from with kind of a strange question like that. So I have a question from the audience. Hello says, premise, if T is a time at which a human being X exists, then X owes thanks to God for existing at T. Premise, if X would be better off not existing at T, then X does not owe anybody thanks for existing at T. Therefore, there is no human being that exists at time at which it would be better for her not to exist. Not sure I completely follow that right yet.
So it sounds like with this, so if I got the premise, I mean, it'd be helpful if I had it in front of me, but the person should be like, let's put it this way. If the person's existence is not overall, if it is not overall better that they should exist than not exist, then they should not be thankful for their existence. And so if there's anybody lost, it follows in the future, it follows that now it is better that they not have existed, just as Jesus rhetorically said to Judas, would be better that he had not have existed than betray the Son of Man. And so they should not be thankful to God for the existence they have, because it's not a good. I mean, I would say a couple things to that. One thing is, I mean, I think the center of it is the whole question of moral accountability. Is that the whole idea is if we're ultimately end up separated from God, and if we understand God by definition to be the source of all goodness, love, and mercy and grace, then it follows necessarily that our separation from him is something we've brought upon ourselves, for which we are morally culpable. So if it turns out that it is better that we should not have existed, it's simply misplaced to project that onto God. It is something that we'd have to own ourselves. It may be better that we not have existed than have existed, but that is something that we have to own in terms of our own moral choices.
Yeah. So what happens, and you kind of brushed on this a little bit, but what happens with, and I think you said a little bit about this when you are on Adherence channel, but what happens if somebody in my family, like say, for example, right now, my brother's agnostic. And so he always probably thinks to himself, well, will his son feel badly, or will we feel badly if we get to heaven and he's not there? What happens then? Would heaven be heaven if we'd be depressed about family members not arriving?
Yeah. So let's start here that this question has a very different answer if you take an eternal conscious torment view versus an annihilationist view. Because on annihilationism, the person that refuses to be reconciled to God in Christ will eventually cease to exist. And it would certainly be a loss, a terrible loss to lose people that you love if they ultimately decide to continue on a self-destructive track. But that does not mean that healing is not possible. So I do think on that view, healing is possible. And eventually people will find the promise of Revelation 21:4 fulfilled, that every tear will be wiped away and they will be able to experience the fullness of God's new creation. It is somewhat of a different story in terms of eternal conscious torment, because on that view, a person who refuses to be reconciled to God continues to exist forever after the general resurrection. And they exist in extraordinary torment or suffering. And it is traditionally understood to be a suffering that involves both conscious awareness, so in terms of mental suffering, I should say, like the loss. Well, it's what theologians would call the pains of loss. So the psychological torment of being separated from God and having missed your alternative, your possibility of salvation, but also the pains of sense, which is the pain of physical torments and suffering. And so on that picture, somebody in heaven in God's presence in the new creation simultaneously exists with potentially people that were loved ones existing with maximal suffering forever in hell. And that creates a much more difficult picture to understand than the annihilationist one.
Yeah, and I think what you pointed out on that other channel that I thought was good about annihilationism is this idea that when people say you're eternally suffering or you're eternally gone, or this is an eternal decision, that you said if someone's annihilated, then that means they're gone into eternity. And so that's how you can kind of reconcile the passages that talk about that.
Yeah, so specifically, that would be like Matthew 25:41 and 46. So where Jesus warns in this parable of the sheep and the goats about these two different states. One of them is eternal punishment, the other is eternal life. first thing we want to keep in mind here is that, of course, that's translation of the Greek, and there the Greek is aionios. So from which we get the word eon, like a long period of time or an indefinite period of time in English. Anyway, so one way to think about that is it's not like the way that eternal conscious torment defenders have, or ECT defenders or traditionalists, you could call them, the way they've defended or interpreted the passage is to say it's a comparison straight up. So if eternal life goes on forever, then the suffering of eternal punishment goes on forever. But what an annihilationist says is there is as much contrast as there is comparison. So yes, there is comparison in that these are two final states. There's no coming back from them. But there's also a contrast. The one continues forever in glorious existence. The other one, the person ceases to exist, but the punishment is final and eternal in that sense, that there's no coming back after it.
Yeah, that's definitely a good answer. And so I see another question from Gavin. It says, the Jewish authorities had the most to gain by Jesus staying dead. Wouldn't the resurrection have been easily falsified by them if it never happened?
Well, of course, what Matthew talks about is Matthew makes reference to this story that apparently was being told at the time that the Jews had stole the body, or that they had said the body. Sorry, that they said the disciples had stolen the body. So that was really the first conspiracy theory, and I think that does get back to a very strong point in favor of the resurrection of Jesus, which is that we can trace back to the 30s belief in the resurrection of Jesus by tracing it in the teaching in 1 Corinthians 15. Because there Paul says, what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. And then he goes through that Christ died, that he was raised for our sins, died for our sins, he was raised, and then he was seen. And he goes through all these post-resurrection appearances. And that's a creedal formula that Paul says he received. And we can probably date him to having received that in around the year 37, which is when he says in Galatians 1 and 2 that he traveled up to Jerusalem to compare notes with Peter and James. And so that means already then they were teaching this resurrection story about Jesus. So we had a resurrection being taught. And if it was being taught in Jerusalem in the 30s, of course, the Jews and the Romans would have produced the body to shut down this emerging movement. They didn't do that. And presumably the best explanation of why they didn't do that is there was no body. So then you do have to explain, well, where'd the body go? And either you're really left with a conspiracy theory, which makes no sense at all, or yes, a resurrection.
Yeah, I agree. Well, actually, going back to Matthew, since you're bringing up Matthew and the surrounding the resurrection story, have you given any thought to those, what the atheists like to say are zombies that appeared, or when the saints came out of their graves and people saw them in the town? As far as, is there any other support for that story, or is it only in Matthew? And do you think it's more of a metaphor? Or do you think it could be true?
Yeah, so let's briefly first deal with the term zombie, which is, certainly a rhetorical term of insult. It's not a serious word here. A zombie is a term from fiction which refers to an undead person. So a person where their corpse becomes reanimated, but they're not alive still. And the use of that word within this context serves a rhetorical service of poisoning the well in other words, discrediting Christians. And so I think it's fair to point out that it's not an apt term, and thus its use is simply a rhetorical one that pollutes the discourse. And so I think it's important to call out that kind of use of rhetoric. In terms of that pericope, which a pericope is like a story in the Gospels, a self-contained story, that is the only place that it's reported. And Matthew was written probably after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, so after 70. And it is fair, from the point of a historian's perspective, to note that if there had been multiple people who came back to life in Jerusalem on that day, there likely would have been other reports of them independently verified. So that led Michael Licona, who's very well known.
Yeah, I've had him on my channel.
Oh, great. Yeah. And so evangelical. And he actually got into trouble by, I think, Wayne Grudem calling him out on this in his really great book on the resurrection, because he simply offered the possibility that his term was midrashic or something, so like a non-historical theological embellishment or something. I may not be conveying the nuance of Licona's position, but his point simply was that you need not think that is historical. to believe and have excellent grounds to believe that the resurrection of Jesus was historical. So I would be a little bit more agnostic. I'm not sure what to do with that story. It very well could have happened. I have no objection to it happening. I think it's also reasonable to think that you might expect independent corroboration of it had it happened apart from the story in Matthew. So I'm not sure what to do about it. But I think we have to keep in mind that not every issue is at the very center of the faith. So the resurrection of Jesus is at the center, but how we understand that story in Matthew 27 is not.
Yeah, very interesting. One way that I would make an argument that it could be true is, it could be true in the form that he expressed it, is I would look at the centurion who was just amazed all of a sudden and said, he must be the Son of God, because you look at the events. There was an earthquake, then the temple cracked and the veil basically was ripped in half. And I know that's a really tremendous thing for the veil to be ripped in half, but the centurion wouldn't have been able to see that rip in half necessarily, because that's inside of the temple and that was away from where Jesus was. So if you look at that thing and you look at the other passages where they say the centurion was amazed and said he must be the Son of God, you realize something significant must have happened besides maybe just an earthquake, because you could kind of write off an earthquake. Earthquake is significant, but those happen a lot. So I'm wondering what you might think of that kind of argument, trying to use an undesigned coincidence and put it together.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly a fan of undesigned coincidences. I know that Tim and Lydia McGrew have done a lot of good work to repristinate or reintroduce people to that line of argumentation, which was quite popular in the 19th century and earlier. So I'm certainly open to that. That's very much possible. I have myself no anti-supernatural bias, right? I'm the more the better. But I also wanted to I guess we have to be careful about, again, kind of not minimal facts necessarily, that approach, but certainly keeping the main thing. So I'm open to those kinds of arguments. I'd have to think more about them, but the strongest evidence is certainly for the historical resurrection of Jesus. And this very well could be additional evidence for that story as well.
Yeah, that's another thing. What's one of your favorite arguments in favor of the resurrection? If you had to go up against somebody, would you choose maybe the prophecies, or would you choose the minimal facts, or undesigned coincidences? Is there anything that's one of your personal favorites if you were debating somebody?
Yeah, I would not. I do not use prophecies in terms of apologetics, and one reason is because you really set yourself up for. Well, first of all, there's a lot of complexity in the way New Testament biblical authors use Old Testament passages. So, for example, it's often not so much like it's not like many of these passages were clearly understood to be prophecies in that way prior to their use in the New Testament, Matthew especially. So when he talks, for example, about in Hosea, out of Egypt I called my son, and a reference to Egypt now becomes a reference to Jesus. And that would be used as a prophecy. Well, but it would not have been understood that way by interpreters of Hosea up to that time, that was a clear reference to Messiah. Even like Isaiah 52 and 53, one of the strongest passages talking about the suffering servant, you nonetheless have, from a Jewish perspective, that is clearly referring to Israel, or quite common to believe that anyway. And I think often what you end up then with is a sort of standoff. So to give you an analogy, one of the passages, there's a passage in Ezekiel that refers to two staffs, a longer and a shorter staff. And Mormons often use that as a prophecy for the Book of Mormon, saying that the shorter staff is the Book of Mormon. And of course, a Christian's not going to find that compelling at all. But what I just think that shows is the degree of subjectivity that is present there is likewise present often when Christians use prophecies in a veridical sense, rather than in a theological sense, to interpret the significance of Jesus as a fulfillment of the Old Testament. So for me, where I would focus my apologetic argument would probably be on the significance, in particular, of 1 Corinthians 15. And again, how you can trace the core beliefs in the death and resurrection of Jesus to the 30s, and just to look at all the possible explanations for what could account for all that evidence. And I think the best explanation would be the resurrection. And then you could supplement that with material from the Gospels as well. But I think 1 Corinthians 15 is probably the strongest basis on which to build a case.
Yeah, certainly strong. And even the skeptics like Bart Ehrman and others acknowledge that it's within 5 years of of the
Yep.
resurrection. So I think that gives us really good support. So I agree with you. I disagree with you on the Isaiah 52 and 53, but that's for another day. Only because I feel like the whole Israel idea, it did come about initially. I think I forgot the early church father who mentioned it could be Israel, but it was also mentioned not till really popularized by Rashi around the year 1000. It's my understanding that it's also appearing that the Jews had an understanding there could be two types of messiahs, as evidenced in the Babylonian Talmud and Sanhedrin 98a. So I do think that they had this conception that this suffering servant was a man back there in Isaiah 53. But that's a tough one. There's other passages in Isaiah that clearly say that the Israel reference could be Jesus as Israel. So that's one where it might be a little bit different. But yeah. So I want to see if the audience has any more questions, because this is fascinating. I have to say you're highly knowledgeable on so many different topics, and I can tell you've been teaching this for a long time because you have such good explanations for everything. It's just really amazing. I wanted to ask you a little bit about what was I going to ask you? Let me just think here. 1 Corinthians 15. Do you see any controversies that are that we can't really fix as far as the Bible, as far as contradictions? Some people think that, I don't know if you're an inerrantist, or if you think you need to be an inerrantist to be following Jesus. I want to see where you are in that sort of thing.
Well, I don't know. It depends how one defines inerrancy. And I think often what ends up happening is people, there's sort of a bleeding between the inerrancy of divine authorial intention and the inerrancy of one's interpretation of the text. So for example, if one person says that, well, a day is a day, and so God created in 6 literal days, another person says, well, no, I understand the purpose of Genesis chapter 1 and 2 very differently, that God accommodated to the ancient Near Eastern understanding of the world, but it also is written in a poetic form, and God is constructing his temple in Genesis 1, and we can actually reconcile all of that with evolutionary processes. Neither one of those persons is denying inerrancy. Both of them could be affirming the text is inerrant, but relative to a different understanding of its genre or its purpose. So I think we get into a kind of difficulty when we use the term inerrancy, because you really have to come down to how does one interpret the text. Now, in terms of contradictions, so this is another thing that I think that it's a mistake to think that every tension in Scripture has to be resolved. I think that what you have here is a very complicated book, and there are often different perspectives. And there are different perspectives that are meant to introduce a tension for the reader. And that doesn't mean that you have to, I think you should wrestle with them and you should draw conviction about it. But here's an example of one, a pretty bald one. If you go through the imprecatory Psalms, so those are the cursing Psalms. I talk about this a fair bit when I lecture on talking about the Bible. If you go through the imprecatory Psalms, the psalmist says God hates the wicked. And I hate the wicked as well. I want to bathe my feet in the blood of the wicked. Lord, break their backs and remove their names from the book of life. And blessed is he who can take one of their infants and smash them against the rocks. And then you have Jesus comes along and says, it has been said, hate your enemy, but I say, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. So does that mean that the psalmist was wrong and that we should just turf those texts or ignore them? Does it mean that actually the psalmist was right and sometimes God hates his enemies, but sometimes not, and sometimes we should and sometimes not? I don't think either one of those options is the right way to go. I think the right way to go is to say those texts are doing something very important there. The first thing they're doing is they're offering a human record of experience. And it's something we can identify with. Just as the psalmist has moments of doubt and moments of joy and moments of questioning, so the psalmist has moments of rage, and so do we. And we can identify with the psalmist. But we should also read the psalmist ultimately through Jesus, who calls us to love our enemies and those who persecute us. So I think that actually, if we can understand the Bible as a text that we inhabit and seek to be Israel, because of course to be Israel, back to the naming of Jacob as Israel, is to wrestle with God. We have permission to wrestle with God in this text. And that doesn't require that we resolve every tension. although we should think through how we understand these things to relate to one another.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. That's and I hadn't really thought about that with Psalms and with Jesus, but I like that perspective. And I also just think that, I mean, Jesus sort of it was a big game changer as far as the culture back then, as far as what he brought to us, this idea of elevating the poor in a way and elevating women and doing the different things that he did. He really changed the whole game as far as how it used to be before that. And so, have you read Tom Holland's Dominion book?
I have not.
It's a really good book because what he's traced back to how the Roman Empire was and how awful it was to live back then, and what the Christians have contributed. And actually, it's my understanding he's even left agnosticism based on what he discovered with Christianity and how it really changed the world. So it's pretty neat stuff. So it might be a good read to pick up.
Excellent.
So who's your favorite? If you had to recommend, if somebody said, Randal, who would you say that we should read if it's a person's just coming to Christianity, or maybe just sort of a weak Christian looking to sort of supplement faith? Aside from your books, definitely want them to read your books. And I saw that you wrote a commentary or something on the Shack, and I've read the Shack, and I think that I'm gonna have to go look at your book on that. But besides that, what other people out there would you recommend to sort of a newbie?
Well, I think C.S. Lewis, of course. I think he's great. I think Scott McKnight is a very good scholar. So he's a New Testament scholar, and also I think quite balanced and engaging theology, and doing so in a way that's accessible to a general readership. In terms of some of the issues we just talked about, I like Christian Smith's book, The Bible Made Impossible, where he takes a look at some of the ways that people have brought expectations to the Bible that are probably not correct, and we need to rethink what God is actually doing in the text. He's actually a sociologist, but I think he does very well in that book. So that would be a suggestion of some possible people you could go to. In terms of hell, because since we've talked a bit about that, Zondervan has a good 4 Views book on hell in their Counterpoint series. And so I think it's Eternal Conscious Torment, Annihilationism, Universalism, which is that everybody is ultimately restored in Christ. I forget the 4th view in that one. It could be like a purgatorial view. But anyway, so that would be another book that I would recommend, kind of, because there's 4 good essayists in that, and getting your feet wet and getting a good overview of the topics. So in fact, generally, I think often the Counterpoint series in Zondervan is a good introduction to many topics, and InterVarsity has a similar series of where you get different perspectives. So I think often readers would find those helpful.
Great. No, that's interesting. I haven't read any of the Zondervan counter series and the 4 perspectives. Obviously, I'm very unstudied in this area as far as heaven and hell. But you made it so interesting on my channel, and also on Adherent Apologetics or Apologist channel, that I really appreciate that, because you've got really interesting insights. What about somebody who's more advanced and they've been studying this for a while and they've read some of the things? But is there any books out now that you think? And you mentioned Tim and Lydia McGrew, by the way, and I'll throw something out to them too, because I've read her books, a couple of her books, and she's does some pretty good stuff out there. And they've been on my channel too.
Oh, good.
So
yeah.
I go around trying to get all the apologists like you, and once I hear somebody really good out there, I'm like, I got to get him on my channel. So that's good. So I would recommend anyone who's been on my channel's books. But are there any other more high level, this is the really deep stuff that you'd recommend?
For what kind of topics? Like for eschatology, hell, heaven, that kind of thing?
Yeah. Heaven, hell, eschatology.
Jerry Walls, he's a philosopher, and he's done a 3-book series. He's Protestant, but he did a book, one on hell, one on heaven, The Logic of Eternal Joy, I think it's called. I forget the one in hell, and the title. And he also did one on purgatory, and defending a theology of purgatory that's consistent with Protestantism, different than some of the Catholic theologies of purgatory. So I mean, that's a really interesting book. So it's written from a systematic philosopher, an analytic philosopher's perspective, but really conversant with theology. In terms of annihilationism, I think that Edward Fudge's book. Now he converted to annihilationism, you could say, some in the 1970s. He published his book originally in 1982, and it's come out in newer editions. So that's a good one, I think, to start with as well. So there are other topics like inclusivism and exclusivism that kind of overlap with these issues. So I think maybe on that topic, John Sanders wrote a book, No Other Name, in the 1990s on an inclusivist perspective. So there's Greg Boyd, call him kind of a progressive evangelical, perhaps, written a lot of good things in that area as well. So yeah, there's certainly a lot of materials out there.
Yeah, there's a lot of people very active, and God is, I think, working through so many people to do so many great things right now. I feel like the way that the United States and Europe have basically been moving towards atheism in some ways. You see that not the United States quite as much as Europe, but I think that there's almost this wave of people coming back, and it's firing up people who might have been apathetic before to get out there and start writing and start talking and giving speeches and doing the things that you're doing, for example, and on your channel. And so if you guys have not yet, I've actually put a link to Dr. Rauser's channel in the description, so you guys can go click on that and please subscribe. We need to build up his channel too. We build up all the apologist channels, so make sure everyone's doing that. And what other questions did I have for you? I think that might be about all the questions that I have for you. But I had a lot, and you've answered them all, and you've done such a fine job that I'm really happy that you came on. So,
wow,
are you teaching this summer?
Well, I'm done now teaching for the summer. So I just wrote my 12th book, actually, and I hope it'll come out this summer. And then, so I teach in the fall and in the winters. Typically, it's what we call a 3-3 course load. So 3 courses in the fall and 3 in the winter. And so usually, yeah, the summers are a little bit more flexible, time for research and writing and that kind of thing.
So what's your book on? What's your 12th book on?
So this one, I haven't sort of settled on the title yet, but it's a conversation with another person, like a fictional person, where we just go through 25 topics from what is apologetics to some major topics in theology and touch on ethics as well. And so there's 25 big topics that we talk about in 50,000 words. So it's about 200 pages. And so that person is sort of a critic or like an atheist or skeptic perspective, and I'm trying to defend this views. And so it's meant to be somewhat of an introduction, maybe a little bit more robust than you might get in some cases, but kind of aiming for a general readership with that one.
And can people find that if they go to your YouTube channel, or do you have a website?
Yeah, I've got my website where I've been blogging for more than 10 years now, I guess, randalrauser.com. So list of my 11 books there, including I've written 3 books with atheists, or 2 books with atheists, and 3 in apologetics anyway. And so this one eventually will be linked there as well when it comes out.
So which atheists are they famous atheists?
Well, one of them, I wrote a book with John Loftus, who's well known for debunking Christianity. And then I wrote one with a fellow named Justin Schieber. And so John Loftus, that book was called God or Godless, 20 Short Debates. I think it's a very good book for a short apologetic introduction or introduction to debate. And then with Justin Schieber, who was a host on Reasonable Doubts, that was a well-known podcast that is now defunct. But we wrote that book called An Atheist and a Christian Walk into a Bar. And so where we had a conversation about each one of us presents 3 arguments, and then the other one offers our rebuttals to those arguments in that book. So it's sort of like 6 big debates.
Oh, that sounds interesting. I like that kind of stuff. I'll have to definitely take a look at that. And I forgot, this is what I did want to ask you before I forget, because I thought of this when you brought it up before, but so where do you put yourself? Are you a young earth creationist, or are you an old earth creationist, or are you just, you believe in evolution? Where are you on that line?
Yeah, no, I would accept theistic evolution. I mean, I'm not a scientist. I certainly have had some involvement with BioLogos. So they're the main evangelical organization that's involved with evolution. They actually flew me out to a conference a few years ago in New York. And so I got to meet Francis Collins at that time, who's, again, a well-known evangelical former head of the National Institute of Health, or is he now, was head of the Human Genome Project, and also was arguing for the full reconciliation of evolution and Christianity. N.T. Wright, or Tom Wright, was also at that conference.
Wow.
Tim Keller's been doing a lot of work recently with him. So I think there's an increasing recognition now that there's no incompatibility with evolution and Christianity. In fact, that was actually much the case in the 19th century as well. So David Livingstone some years ago wrote a book called Darwin's Forgotten Defenders, where he points out that many of the original popularizers of evolution in North America, like Asa Gray, were in fact evangelical Protestant scientists. And it was really only with the fundamentalist controversies in the 1920s that there was an increased opposition between evolution and Christianity. And actually, Ronald Numbers, he's a historian, his book, The Creationists, tells that story from a historical perspective. So yes, I'm not a young earth creationist. I would be a theistic evolutionist.
Okay. Yeah. See, I kind of fall in that same group with you. And I don't really, evolution isn't something I even really care about, but people tend to get so fired up about it. I figured I'd ask you. Okay. I have one last question before we go. It's from Gavin Hurlman. It says, the theist versus atheist contention seems to be political rather than philosophical. Your thoughts? Do you think the tension is political or philosophical?
Well, I'm not sure what he's referring to. So certainly I understand what politics is, the governance of the polis or of the state, and there can be political implications of our various views. But I think theism and atheism, or Christianity and atheism, both underdetermine politics. What that means is that you can find atheists across the political spectrum as you can with Christians. They can be across the political spectrum. So I'm not a big fan of Christians being limited to one political party. I think that that's a mistake.
I'm not either. I agree with you. They always say that they make an assumption that, hey, you're a Christian, you must have voted for Trump. And I'm like, actually, I didn't vote for Trump.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, but I get concerned whenever anybody aligns Christianity with any political party, because I think one of the things we get is when people are in another political party than you and they have a different political vision, then they end up being as iron sharpens iron, and each one is challenging the other. And there's such a danger as well of the church being co-opted and exploited by political parties, treating us as a voting bloc to further their interests. And we have to be very careful of wanting power. I think, ironically, like the fundamentalists throughout the 20th century were very countercultural until 1979, and then the rise of the moral majority. And with the election of Ronald Reagan, they got a taste of power because he courted them as a voting bloc. And you had Christian conservatives being courted by Republicans ever since then. And I think it has not been healthy for the Christian witness to be aligned with one simple political party. Because then Christianity has implications of being, skeptical about climate change. Well, I mean, we should be able to be skeptical about climate change or accept it, because that's not in the creeds. But or the free market, or a particular view on gun control. I think all of those things kind of divert or they dilute the sort of the focus we get when we understand the gospel as something distinct from our political affiliations.
Yeah, I agree. Sorry, I have one last question from John. John, this has got to be the last question, but because this completely relates to what we were talking about. Can someone who doesn't believe in Christ in this life be saved by accepting Christ after their death or at the moment of judgment?
So that is called a second chance theology. There have been people that have explored the possibility of a second chance theology. George Limbeck was an example of a Protestant Lutheran who did so. People often say no, and then they sort of cite Hebrews 9:27, after death there is but judgment. I would simply say this. I would say that, well, let me put it this way, that imagine that I'll give you a concrete example. So I give this in one of my books. There was, in the 16th century, the conquistadors took over the island of Hispaniola that later became the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And they eradicated the indigenous population there. And they rounded up the tribal leaders who were called caciques. And so this one cacique, now they were all told that you have to confess the Apostles' Creed. And if you confess the Apostles' Creed before you're executed, you'll go to heaven. And this cacique named Hatui, he says, well, where do the conquistadors go? And then the Franciscan priest said, well, they go to heaven. But if you don't confess it, you'll go to hell. So then this cacique says, I want to go to hell. Was he really asking to go to hell? Or was he asking to go to the place opposite from where the genocidaires who were carrying out the eradication of the population were going? Which raises an interesting theological question. What does it mean to reject the gospel? Because sometimes the gospel that is presented to people is very far from what it should be. And I would simply say this: if anybody non-culpably, in terms of no fault of their own, rejects what they think is the gospel because it actually wasn't the gospel, they will have the opportunity to have full clarity and know what they're rejecting. Whether that's at the moment of death, whether it's in the afterlife, or whether it works out some other way, I have no doubt that with a God of justice and mercy, that God will take care of that and show them the kind of mercy and justice that he would show to us as well.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And I do feel like, I mean, there's a part of me that wants to say the Great Divorce is something that could happen and it's possible. And it's, I mean, I really like that book. So, but we can't know for sure on a lot of these kind of things because there are different passages out there that people can look at. So it's a confusing topic. So
yeah, it is.
Well, listen, I want to say thank you so much for coming on. I know that I'm gonna listen to this again, actually, to try to learn some more of what you've been saying, so that'll just make it more interesting for me. And I hope that everybody in the crowd here, there's a bunch of people watching, and I hope you guys all had a good time listening. I found him on
Jamie, I'm on an interview. Thanks.
Oh.
Okay, that's family life when you're at home in exile. So.
Oh yeah, it's COVID life. I've got my kids home. I need them to go to school next year. If they don't put them in school in the fall, I'm going to flip out. Yeah. So anyway, you can also find Randal Rauser on Twitter at Randal Rauser, I believe is what it is, and it's with an L. And then I'm going to put a link to that, and I've also got a link in the description to your YouTube channel. Your dog sounds very cute.
Yeah, they're real charmers, I gotta say.
No, that's great. So thank you so much, Randal. I'm going to go ahead and end the stream here. Thank you.
You bet.
Everybody.
Okay, SJ. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Yeah, I really appreciate it. You had so much knowledge.